Well, hello, it's Fred Weems. Today is March 21st, 2020, and I'm going to talk a bit about the novels of Herman Melville, and I'm going to make the case that the American literary establishment's preference for Moby-Dick over a preference for the entire output of Herman Melville is not a good thing. Most people who have really attempted to dive into American literature, most of these being people who major in English in college or read heavily in high school, are told, well, you must read Moby-Dick. Now, the problem with this is not that they ought not to read Moby-Dick. They absolutely should. But the reader is best prepared for that book by reading the 4 or is it 5 previous books by Herman Melville. I believe Melville's first novel, remember that Moby-Dick is published in 1851, Melville's first novel, TYPEE, I believe is published in 1840. The next one is OMOO, and that is followed by a book that I believe to be the stylistic, though not thematic, superior to Moby-Dick, MARDI, which is about 700 pages of a cruise on a small vessel through an archipelago that is not replicated in real life. It is a completely fantastic set of islands. Nothing supernatural. Actually, there is a supernatural element, a la Midsummer Night's Dream at one point. But it is soaring, poetic prose, and the mere sound of it is what makes me recommend it so much. It is a musical prose of a sort that Melville never matched again. There are chapters of Moby-Dick where he equals it, and probably a few chapters where he surpasses it. But the pure sound, I'm talking about the sound of the words, is some sort of equivalent of Mozart in many instances. In fact, he mentions Mozart in one of his books. It's weird to think of Melville even thinking of Mozart. In any case, the first 3 novels are TYPEE, a relatively realistic but not entirely factual account of his captivity among the indigenous peoples of a little island, and I think more or less in the South Seas. I think it's based on Tahiti. Don't quote me. But the next one, OMOO, is a sort of sequel to that and much inferior to the first one. It's entertaining enough, but it does not have any drive. It's after he gets out of captivity, and he and a friend of his wander around. As with all of Melville, there are moments of actual historic description he talks about certain events. Obviously, I think around that time Tahiti was having some terrible conflict involving the French and the English. In any case, Melville really despised the French missionaries that he felt, sapped the soul of Tahiti. Following OMOO, he writes MARDI, this incredible thing. And then he begins losing money. Believe it or not, the TYPEE caused Melville to be, for a lack of a better word, because remember, this is the 1840s, a best-selling writer. It established him among the New York elite. The publishing world loved him. He was the toast of New York. He was becoming very subtly pretty well off. So he writes OMOO, sells pretty well, not as well as TYPEE. TYPEE constantly sells well up until Moby-Dick, which scuttles Melville's fortunes. Anyway, OMOO comes along, and it is this episodic little book where each chapter is actually about 4 to 6 pages, but very intense prose, and usually hitting a little bit of philosophy or history, and the characters aboard this little boat argue with each other about history and philosophy the way the characters in Pogo might. It's very similar to the standard American road trip. These characters are on the road, and they joke, they make fun of each other, they play practical jokes on each other while discussing philosophy. And yet the philosophy in MARDI, there are mentions of the great philosophers of world history, but he invents a whole bunch of them for the book. He comes up with and devises philosophies for his characters to talk about. It is really a marvelous book, and nobody reads it. The frustration of even the scholars seems to be that there seems not to be any giant point to it, but I think it's actually it's a book about a bunch of friends paddling around and bullshitting with each other in very high language. There's a great chapter about a writer they visit who was once very successful and then fell out of favor because his books got too confusing. And this is interesting because he hasn't written Moby-Dick yet, which brought him that fate. Anyway, OMOO fails financially. And to make money, he writes 2 books that he willingly dismisses in letters to his friends as trash. And he was, really undercutting himself. They're very good books. One is called Redburn, and one is called White Jacket. They came in within a year of each other. I think 1848 and 1849. In Redburn, there is an instance of spontaneous combustion. A ship's crew member drinks himself to death and essentially burns up. And I'm reading an article right here. It's in front of me. It's on the internet here. It says here, spontaneous human combustion, SHC, has been part of folklore since well before Melville's time. Had been part of. Cases were reported in the 17th century, and SHC was used as a successful defense in an 18th century murder trial. According to the mythology of the time, persons were subjected to SHC because they were heavy drinkers or because they embodied a particularly intense but unorthodox religious energy. Walker says that SHC was melodrama, thrilling spectacle, such stuff as nightmares were made on. It would appear that SHC was de rigueur as an indication that the unfortunate victim had merited a direct manifestation of the wrath of God. Incidents of SHC occur or are suggested in Dickens' Bleak House, 1853, about 10 years after this one. Washington Irving, Knickerbocker History of New York, Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi, obviously much later, and Zola, Le Docteur Pascal. And in any case, back to the first page of this article, which is by a guy named Ernest S. Bernard, and I got it from a page called JSTOR. I had to subscribe. It's one of my free articles, so I'm not going to quote too much of it because it's probably copyrighted. But he makes a good point right here toward the beginning. One of the horrific incidents is the apparent spontaneous combustion of a sailor aboard the Highlander, introducing elements of Gothic terror into the frequently deistic metaphysic of Melville. The scene is frightening, almost offensive in its detail. Why did Melville choose to include it? The sailor is not an important character otherwise. His death and the manner of it would seem unnecessary to the development of the story. Was the incident included, as Walker suggests, to pad the list of shocking experiences? Well, given that Melville wrote to friends saying, this is just trash, literally to keep... it's in the article too. Either way, Melville puts it down. The thing is this, an astute reader will pick up that there is spontaneous combustion. I read this. It's mentioned, it takes about 3 paragraphs. The chapter involving the sailor may be about 4 pages tops. But just a few paragraphs about the fact that, he was a stinking drunk and he's been dead for days and they didn't know it. He's all charred and they don't know what happened and his bed is charred. And then Melville goes on a bit to imply it's spontaneous combustion. The author of this article says it's funny that Melville doesn't refer back to it later, the way in his other books he refers back to something. But what actually happens here is he does refer to it later because he points out that all the sailors, even though there's a shortage of beds or bunks, are deathly afraid to lie on top of this space that body had occupied. And I guess they pick up a new sailor and they put him right on it without telling him. In any case, I'm trying to point out that Melville tells interesting stories long before Moby-Dick. Redburn is the voyage of the first whaling voyage, or I think it's a whaling voyage. I read it about 6 months ago. I'm getting old and I forget stuff. And he is his time on the ship, and it actually, it talks about how life aboard ship can be very tough and all of that. And he and his friend, during their leave, they go to London and they get stuck in this gambling house. Heavy implication is it's a house of male prostitution, and the Melville protagonist doesn't know it. And his friend, he asks his friend what's happening. His friend says, never talk to me about this again. And anyway, the description of the place is, it's a description that pops up in diaries of a lot of writers from around that time. It seems to have been based on a real place. So yeah, Melville describes a lot of ugly stuff in Redburn. It gets much uglier and much angrier in a book clearly meant to start reforms, White Jacket, the year later, which is about life aboard a U.S. naval vessel. Melville did serve on a naval vessel for a year. And indeed, the whole book is about the horrors that the whipping involves. And this is the U.S. government. When it was published, Harper and Row sent it out to every member of Congress. And reforms were issued, and I believe flogging ended. So give Melville some cred. If Oliver Twist helped reform British, the way the British treated children, Melville actually managed to get reforms passed in this country. Remember, his father was the Chief Justice, his father-in-law was the Chief Justice of the state of New York. Melville in the middle of Whitejacket, toward the end, he says, long after I got out of the Navy, I was at a party of ambassadors in Washington, D.C., and you're going, wait, this character is having such a hard time on the ship, is among the social elite, and he is. Either way, Melville, before Moby-Dick, he's a best-selling writer. He is so well positioned that his book creates reforms, his book about the Navy. Anyway, once he writes these two books that he calls trash, but which are definitely not, he sets out to write Moby-Dick. It takes him a little longer than usual, something like a year and a half. Consider this. This was a man he had just turned 32 when he published Moby-Dick. For the past 10 years, he'd written something like, let's see, TYPEE, OMOO, MARDI, Whitejacket, 5 novels, each of them over 400 pages, and at least one of them 700 pages. He writes them at breakneck speed. The language is completely ornate. And in the case of MARDI, it is, I believe, music in prose. So he writes Moby-Dick, and what the great merit of that book is its theme. It is everybody understands man against will. It is a myth. He creates this thing that is, for pure symbolism, is unmatched in most literature around the world. That said, I read the novels that came before Moby-Dick last year. I spent about 8 months reading straight in order, TYPEE through Moby-Dick. And I have to say, Moby-Dick, which I'd read in college, actually no, late high school, 11th grade through 12th on my own. The thing that strikes me is that had I not had these other books in me this past year before I started my rereading of Moby-Dick, I think I'd have been overwhelmed by the length of a lot of the sentences in Moby-Dick. I kept finding myself, even this time around, losing the thread of what he's trying to say in any given sentence, which does not happen in MARDI. You have long sentences in MARDI, but you know where they're going. In Moby-Dick, it's very, very difficult. The sentences sort of drop off into the ether, and you kind of, if you really get into your subconscious, you kind of get a sense of what he means. But if you're reading too literally, you're going, what did he just say here? This does not mean it's a flaw. It means it is incredibly ambiguous a lot of time what he is trying to say. And he clearly was blindsided when the thing tanked, and people began writing reviews that were incredibly scathing, saying Herman Melville insane. That's the headline of one of them. All through it, he was courting this woman. Now, he was married, he had children, and it wasn't. They cannot demonstrate an actual sexual affair. But as he wrote Moby-Dick, thinking he had all this money that would be coming to him for writing a book that might be really successful, his uncle had just sold a house that his uncle had in the woods in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And Melville, they rented it out to guests, and one of the guests was a British lord and his wife, and they wanted to buy it. They bought it, and Melville promptly took the money that he was forwarded and borrowed some more from his father-in-law to build a property less than a mile away, because he had become so enamored of this woman. This is one thing most Melville scholars don't talk about. It's in a book called Melville in Love, a non-fiction account that really, really lays out that what happened was he and this woman were intellectual equals. She was really, really literary. She prompted him to write some Civil War poems at the beginning of the war. She and Melville hosted at her house a bunch of soldiers on leave during the war. Anyway, he attended masquerade balls that he set up with her, and meanwhile his wife is sort of shunted aside. She becomes his soulmate. They do have some letters that she kept, but none that he kept. And this guy traced it all. What it was is, if you've ever read The Age of Innocence, where the entire social set around the main character comes down on him and essentially prevents his affair with this woman who's called like the Countess, but is actually an English woman, I think. Edith Wharton knew that world. She's writing about the 1850s in that world, and Moby-Dick is 1851. And it matches what Melville went through. The affair is put to an end, I think, just after Moby-Dick is finished. She even has a party for him, actually, just the day of the publication, and puts a little crown on him. He goes, no, I shall not wear a crown. Either way, he scared the horses with this sort of affair. And I mean, it was an affair lived with all his literary friends from the different magazines. He invited them all up to camp with her and with him. I'm not using good grammar, am I? Well, it's the 21st century, thank you. And they go up, they climb this mountain near there, Greylock, Mount Greylock, which his next book is dedicated to. And they camp out, and these writers are scandalized, writers and editors. And one of them, a good friend of his, writes a negative review of Moby-Dick. He loses their favor. This is one reason, not the complexity of his books, but the fact that he became, I won't pronounce it right, he behaved in an outre manner. And, he goes horseback riding with her all the time. Meanwhile, his wife and the brood and his mother and his sister are all at the house sitting there, and he's gallivanting around on horseback with this witty English woman who herself writes Civil War poetry and good poetry. Now, obviously it's not the Civil War yet, but she lives a while and helps, But the affair itself essentially ends by the early 1850s. The chronology is indeed kind of weird, isn't it? But the author goes into this. She kind of, I guess they lived there for, as next door neighbors for a long time. But I think they don't associate with each other much, except for extreme situations such as having this party for these Civil War soldiers. I'm going on and on. After Moby-Dick, he writes several more novels that absolutely tank. I think The Confidence Man from 1853 sells something like 40 copies, or is it 4? Either way, it's terrible. Library of America, these are the next books. Pierre, which is about an affair this young fellow conducts to the horror of his family he breaks off from his fiancée and starts living with a girl he realizes is his illegitimate sister, and they live as man and wife. Weird stuff. The author of Melville and Love, whose name escapes me, points out that he wanted to demonstrate some outre thing. It's not really about incest because he's not going into the details, but it is about shocking society. Think that as you will. Either way, he was, for a guy who had managed to make people think he just wrote about wild adventures, he took it all inland and writes this thing about this horrible, smothering mother. Anyway, Israel Potter is great. It's Israel Potter, his 50 Years of Exile. That's about, it's not great. It is well written and very funny. Based on a true story, based on the journals of a man who was impressed into the British Army during the War of 1812, I think. A real guy. One thing about Melville, he has a very 18th century, not 19th, 18th century tendency to quote verbatim large chapters of other people's works. you want to call plagiarism, you could, but he always spins it, and he puts in a thing. And his next book, besides the Piazza Tales, which are great short stories, among them Bartleby the Scrivener, which are occasionally published until they start rejecting his stories, or he doesn't submit anymore, I forget what. The Confidence Man, that's the one that sold like 4 or 40 copies. That's episodic, just little chapters aboard a steamboat, again, you're inland, where one con man after another cons a different con man in each successive chapter until the end implies something horrible. In any case, that's published in 1853. He lives until, I believe, 1881. Where is it even? 91. God damn, let's see if it'll tell me here. Chronology, 1437. We're getting there, And yes, Moby-Dick is written at the tail end. He sticks it in a drawer and dies, and they don't find it for 12 years. Chronology. Let's see when he dies. Born in 1819, and he dies in 1891. Okay, yes, he dies in 1891. So he stops writing novels in 1853, and certainly has no expectation of selling. He wrote at the time of MARDI, I think I won't write books that sell. Either way, he had written a book that sold. He had been quite popular, and even when there was an occasional reprint of one of his other books, during that period of literary exile, it'll say by the author of TYPEE. And Melville has dinner at the Dakota in the last year or so of his life. And the hostess, who doesn't know all her guests personally, writes in her diary, "Mr. Melville was here. I thought he'd been dead 30 years. Thank you very much.